Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight we will be closing the book on Romans, chapter 16. Rabbi, welcome back to the show, sir. It's always a great pleasure having you here, and very excited to hear what you have in store for all of us this evening. So thank you for
It is awesome to be back with you.
Excellent. It's my pleasure for sure, no doubt.
How does my modem speed?
Hopefully better than last week.
Yeah.
That's great. All right. So I'm trying to stream on Facebook as well. I need to make sure. Hey, honey, will you do me a favor? Make sure no one's using YouTube or any kind of Netflix, because I'm already seeing an alert on my signal bandwidth. So
hey, you kids, get off the.
Well, I have just enough to do to stream. I mean, the thing is, for me to be able to stream in like more than two locations, for example, it requires more upload speed, and so I've got just enough upload speed to be able to stream in two different places, as long as no one else is using the internet. Oh, was she? Okay, so if it started on YouTube on hold on a second. So
hey,
okay,
you kids, get off.
I guess it's working. Okay, that's good news. So apparently my Wirecast is giving me a false positive or false negative. I don't know. It seems like it's actually streaming fine in both places, so that's good. All right, yeah. Okay. So as long as they get that, I'm happy. We're good to go. So okay, yeah. So tonight, this is it. This is where we hit the ballpark, or hit the ball out of the park, I guess, and move on to 1 Corinthians, right after tonight. So
yeah, that's hopefully
that's
the plan.
Yes, indeed.
This is it's interesting. The last few chapters of Romans, once we got past, must have been 11 or 12, it got a little bit light and boring.
Right.
So these are going to be quick. So the last chapter here, Paul basically begins by really sending a letter of recommendation to the church in Rome about Phoebe, and he basically gives her a good recommendation, and some scholars believe that actually she's the person that carried his letter to the Romans from Corinth, where he wrote it. Right? He's obviously, this is Paul's letter to the Romans, and Paul is not in Rome. If he was, he wouldn't have to write them a letter.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
he's writing this from Corinth, and a lot of the different, I guess, commentaries to Romans think that Phoebe is the one that actually took the letter from him to the church in Rome. And it's interesting that here again, the chapter starts off, I guess, in this very homey fashion. That he's sending, a nice letter, telling everybody what a great woman she is. And I mentioned the last time we met that this kind of chapter that we'll be reading, where basically Paul is giving his regards to like dozens of people in Rome, it doesn't sound that much like divine revelation to me. It sounds more like a very personal kind of letter. And I mentioned this when we looked at parts of chapter 15. When I read it, it seems to just strike me as the kind of letter that someone like Paul would write to, his colleagues. And to me, it doesn't sound like, when we're used to studying the Tanakh, where every chapter, sometimes every verse begins, thus says the Lord, and God said to Moses, saying, I mean, there, even the form of it sounds like it's divinely revealed. And here it just, to me, reads like a personal letter. And I'll just mention, aside from what we did last time in chapter 15, I'll mention a few other examples, which we'll have a chance to go over more when we actually get to these chapters. But just a few other examples of, again, just to me, and I guess my my jaded perspective
Right.
is that I see these as just typical of you know the writings of someone who just seems to be writing his own material. So when we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul actually says that he's sharing his own opinions. This is his own point of view on issues of women in marriage and stuff like that. So he's not even trying to conceal the fact that this is his own material. He's not claiming that he received this somehow as as a message from God. Then it gets really, really strange when you get to, for example, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13. In his second letter to Timothy, Paul writes, "When you come, bring me the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus and the books, especially the parchments." I mean, it sounds like he was visiting some people, and he left some stuff behind. And he says, in his letter to Timothy, he says, just don't forget, when you see me, bring those things to me. So again, when I read that, to me, I don't think that this is something that anyone would imagine was revealed by God.
That's interesting you said that, because that's something that I would bring up from time to time in the past, where when I would talk to people, they would say that the entire New Testament was God breathed, and I'm like, well, according to Paul, it wasn't. So if you could even find, by logic, if you could even find one place where Paul admits, this is me, this is not from God, this is what I think, then chances are there's at least that one for sure, but there's quite possibly a lot more. So,
well, you're raising a good point that it becomes problematic and dangerous once you open that door and say that even one passage is not divinely inspired. Then it raises a very uncomfortable question, which is how much other stuff, and who makes those decisions. Mm-hmm. And so I guess those that want to take a conservative point of view, typically evangelicals and others, they have to sort of double down and insist that no, every single word, every word is divinely inspired, it's breathed by God, it's all revelation, this is all coming from God. And so, it's a strong point of view, meaning that it sounds like it's a strong point of view. The problem is it's hard to defend it when you get to passages like this. Another one I'll just point out is from Philemon. I never really knew how to pronounce the name of that book. I used to always call it Philemon.
I used to the same here.
And then I went to Google. There's a thing. How do you pronounce? So I think they said it's pronounced Philemon.
Philemon,
which I like Philemon better.
Anyway, I do too. Sounds cooler.
In his letter to Philemon. It's only one chapter, I think, actually. So in verses 18 to 19, Paul writes, "But if he wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay it." So Paul is basically saying, look, even if my friend stiffed you from something, don't worry, I'll pay the bill. I'll pay the check. And again, so maybe I don't get it, but when I read material like this, it strikes me as being very personal, and simply that Paul's just writing this on his own accord. So I think that anyone that goes through chapter 16 of Romans, when they read all these, regards and Paul's is just saying hi to everyone, and it just strikes me like that. Although I wouldn't make a federal case out of this. So the next part I wanted to point out, actually going to skip quite far now, all the way over to verse 20.
And 16?
Yeah, in verse 20, Paul says that, "And the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly." That's a pretty pregnant kind of passage. And the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly. So it seems to me that, throughout Paul's writings, and I'll mention this especially when we get into the first chapter of First Corinthians, but even at the end here, we're going to see the same thing. And I've been saying this all along. Paul is consistently distinguishing between God and Jesus. And so when he speaks here about God, the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly, it seems to me that he's not speaking here about Jesus. He's speaking about here, I guess, what Christians would refer to as God the Father. And he's saying that God will crush Satan under your feet shortly. Now, anyone that's familiar with Christian apologetics, this should send off like an alarm bell in their head, because where is Satan being crushed? It's being crushed under the feet of the people that Paul is writing to, which is the Church of Rome, and I guess any other reader of his letter. And so what is striking here is that Satan is being crushed not under the feet of a single individual, but under, right? It doesn't say under his foot, it says under your feet, meaning he's speaking to the whole Church of Rome, the Roman Church. And this seems to contradict the way Christians historically have understood Genesis 3:15. They take Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy, really, about what Jesus is going to do. And it says there that God says, I will put enmity, I'll put hatred between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. So this is what Christians will refer to as the seed of the woman. And unfortunately, they understand seed as referring to only one person, and that being Jesus. And they say, and then the verse goes on, he will bruise your head, meaning that the snake, I'm sorry, God is speaking to the snake here, and it says to the snake, he will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. So the snake is going to strike human beings at the heel, but that the seed of the woman is going to bruise the head of the snake, which Christians understand to mean that Jesus is going to destroy the snake, that the snake's head is going to be bruised under the foot of Jesus. So that's typically how Christians have understood Genesis 3:15, that the crushing of the snake, of Satan, is going to take place under the foot of Jesus. But here, Paul seems to be saying that Satan is going to be crushed under the feet of the church, not an individual. And the truth is that this is actually, on some level, it's really correct, because we see from the Tanakh that the redemption, right, the sort of the bringing about of the utopian messianic age, really takes place as a result of the national restoration and repentance of Israel. So we know that in Deuteronomy chapter 30, God says that when Israel, the nation, returns to God, God will begin to bring about the messianic program of returning the Jewish people to their homeland, etc. And then we know in Isaiah 59, chapter 59, verse 20, Isaiah says that the Redeemer will come to those who have turned away from sin. That meaning when Israel turns away from sin, the Redeemer will come, the Messiah will come. And that's when the Tanakh doesn't speak about the Messiah destroying the works of Satan. But if you want to think in those terms, it's really the result of, and any future progress is the result of what the nation does. The Messiah is not separate from the nation. The Messiah is not, sort of disconnected from the nation. And the Messiah is basically just the tip of the iceberg. And whatever the Messiah is doing is in conjunction with the nation. So really Paul seems to at least be in the ballpark here. Of course, I don't think that he's correct in terms of identifying the mechanism to be the efforts of the church. But I think the idea that Satan's going to be crushed under the feet of not a person but under a people. Now, there are a number of other problems with this verse. It's interesting that what the Christian scriptures seem to repeatedly say is that Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. That's 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, that Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. And you see something very similar in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, that through his death, through the death of Jesus, he might render the devil powerless. So what you find in the Christian Bible is the idea that Jesus, what was his purpose in coming? What did he accomplish? So there seems to be the teaching that his death accomplished victory over Satan, victory over the devil. Right? That's what Hebrews says, that through his death we might render the devil powerless. And that Jesus came in 1 John 3:8 to destroy the works of the devil. So if that supposedly happened with the coming of Jesus, why does Paul say here that Satan is going to be crushed shortly? Meaning this is already 25 years after the death of Jesus. It sounds like Satan has not yet been crushed. And yet, you have all these passages that seem to be saying that that's exactly what Jesus came to do, was to destroy the power and the works of Satan. So it's sort of strange that what Jesus was supposed to have already accomplished, Paul is admitting, no, it hasn't happened yet, and Paul says it's going to happen shortly. Now again, let's think about that. Paul is writing this around, the scholars think that Paul is writing Romans, somewhere in the 50s. So let's say it's a generation after the passing of Jesus, and Paul says but Satan's going to be crushed shortly. What does shortly mean? How do we understand the word shortly? However you would want to define it, I don't think anyone's going to say that 2,000 plus years is shortly. So Paul is making a prediction here that seems very, very difficult to justify. Meaning that if he's admitting already that Jesus didn't accomplish this with his coming and dying, and that it's going to happen shortly, we've been waiting a very, very long time. And so that's, I think, another serious problem with this verse in Romans. It's very clear, it should be very clear to anyone, that the power of Satan has not yet been destroyed. Back in 1 John chapter 3, it says that sin is only possible when Satan is in control. Now, we know that there's a lot of sin going on in the world. Even among Christians, a lot of sin is taking place. So, it's pretty obvious that Satan has not been destroyed. Or it's interesting that back in the time of Paul, when we get to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 18, so Paul sort of laments there. He says, we wanted to come to you, but Satan hindered us. Well, how is Satan able to hinder him if Satan's been destroyed, if Satan's power has been destroyed?
Right.
So obviously, this is problematic in so many different ways, and I don't know if there's any real way of defending this. So Paul ends this chapter, and this is going to really conclude our study of Romans, with basically a benediction. This is what many of the Bibles, they claim that these last few verses are. It's Paul's benediction. And he says in verse 25, Now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and keep the preaching of the Messiah Jesus, according to the revelation of the mystery kept secret since the world began, but now, in verse 26, but now made manifest, and by the prophetic scriptures made known to all nations. Now, this is a real mouthful, and we're going to have to sort of wrap our head around what's going on here. So Paul refers to what he says in verse 25. He refers to my gospel. And actually, he does this a number of times in the Christian Bible. It's not only here that he refers to my gospel. And so what is this referring to when Paul says my gospel? He goes on to say in the next phrase, and the preaching of Jesus. My gospel and the preaching of Jesus. So one thing is pretty clear, that in all of Paul's writings, in all of his letters, he mentions virtually nothing about anything that Jesus ever preached.
Rabbi,
Are we on?
Yeah, we're still good. I had my mic turned down. Can you actually still hear me?
Not before, but now I do.
I turned my mic down to ask my daughter a question, and it's like, then you stopped. I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot to turn my mic down. Okay, no, you're good. You're good. Thanks. Go right ahead. We're still live. Thanks. Okay.
You know what? I guess it's when I can see you, then it's really confusing.
Right. I forgot I've got you a camera now.
That's right.
Sorry about that.
You've got to watch what you're doing.
Yes, sir. Okay, good deal. All right, carry on. That's funny.
Can't be playing any kind of computer games.
Right, that's great. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Big Brother is watching.
Oh, man, that's funny. Go for it.
So we'll get back to this phrase when he speaks about my gospel, which is, again, something that he speaks about quite a few times. But I just wanted to point out that when he speaks about his gospel in the next breath, he says the preaching of Jesus, Paul really almost virtually never mentions anything that Jesus ever preached. He seems to be ignorant of any of the details of Jesus's life. All Paul seems to know about is that Jesus was born and he died. He doesn't really know almost anything in between, and certainly he virtually never quotes anything that Jesus taught, which is again peculiar, because he's always claiming to be a great apostle of Jesus. But I want to get back to this phrase, my gospel. What does Paul mean by this? So I'm going to suggest, and this is just me going out on a limb, that my feeling is that his gospel, his preaching, was basically different from the teachings of both Jesus and the apostles, the actual disciples of Jesus. Because again, I don't know how much Paul really knew about what Jesus taught and what the disciples taught. And I think that at the end of the day, when we compare the preaching of Paul to the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, they don't really have all that much in common. So what does it mean when Paul says my gospel? I think that what Paul's referring to is the idea that Jesus' death atones for sin, that Jesus' death replaces the sacrificial system, that faith in Jesus replaces Torah observance. That seems to be, and we saw this definitely in Romans, right? That Paul essentially says that the Torah is pretty useless because you can't keep it anyway. And so, to a great extent in Romans, Paul explained why he doesn't put his eggs in that basket of the Torah observance. He's putting his eggs in the basket of just faith in Jesus and faith in the death of Jesus. And for him, that's where it's at. And it seems to me that these teachings of the centrality of Jesus' death as a sacrifice to atone for sin of those who would believe in him, the idea that his death replaces the sacrificial system, the idea that faith in Jesus replaces Torah observance. I think that it doesn't at all really seem to be supported by anything Jesus taught, or what the apostles taught, or what the apostles did. We know that after Jesus died, the apostles were still going to the temple in Jerusalem and bringing sacrifices, even sin offerings.
Right.
And we know that there was another approach to the teachings of Jesus, which was the approach that was carried on in the 2nd century by the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, for whom Torah observance was central. And we know that that group died out by the 4th century. There were no other Torah observant followers of Jesus. All you really had was the really Gentile church that was birthed by Paul. And for them, the teachings of Jesus are only what they hear from Paul's understanding. It basically is all, the innovations, I believe, of Paul. And I think that's what he refers to as my gospel. Now, he refers in the next phrase to the revelation of the mystery kept secret since the world began. That's a very mysterious phrase, that he's referring to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret since the world began. What is this mystery that's been kept secret? So the MacArthur Study Bible says that basically the secret Paul's referring to is the idea that Israel, the chosen people, will be going through or have gone through a spiritual blindness, and this will allow for Gentiles to become part of God's people. And when that happens, Israel is going to get provoked to jealousy, and then they will come back, even though they were broken off, as Paul refers to, they were branches that were broken off the olive tree. The mystery, according to MacArthur, and actually according to many other commentaries to the Christian Bible, this is the mystery. The great mystery was that it seemed like originally God's plan was through Israel, but that's basically been detoured because Israel, for whatever reasons, did not get it, and that allowed the nations, the Gentiles, to come into God's people, to be grafted into the olive tree. And when that happens, according to this mystery that was kept secret since the world began, the Gentiles are going to provoke the Jews for jealousy, and they're going to sort of get grafted back into the olive tree. According to the
So how does that flow with Deuteronomy 29:29? The secret things belong to, and it's like for me, when I read that, and of course this is obviously not a native Hebrew speaker, but when I read that verse, I'm trying to pull it back up here again. I think it was 29:29. Let me go back to it here.
The secret things belong to the Lord our God,
yes,
but that which is revealed,
yes,
is revealed unto us and our children. I think to do all the work of all the
right. So
yeah, it's interesting.
So my question and point would be, if that says anything, I mean, to me, I look at that and I think, well, anything that was secret or hidden or something that needs to be revealed, it won't be revealed to the Jamaicans. It won't be revealed to the Hindus. It'll be revealed to the actual people of God, the actual, the Jewish people. So how is it even conceivable that a non-Jewish people would think that they got a revelation from God that the Jews were naive to, that they were not able to see or even hear whenever it's been pre-foretold ahead of time that that's not how it's going to work?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I guess what Paul would say is that maybe you're right. That's the way it should have been. But Israel was blinded by Satan. And so they had to be, removed from the picture for a while.
And so
they became irrelevant.
And God he didn't have enough insight to see that was going to happen. I mean, it still puzzles me, so.
Yeah, it's a puzzling idea.
Right.
I mean, especially when Deuteronomy 29 says that, that really at the end of the day, that what's the mystery, whatever it is, that involves, not the abrogation of observing the Torah. Paul's plan doesn't seem to really involve that much Torah observance.
Right.
So the NLT Study Bible just tweaks this a little bit and says that actually when you go through the Tanakh, the conversion of the Gentiles was predicted. And actually, we agree with that. We agree that the Tanakh's one of the great messages is that one day the message of, the one absolute one God will be accepted by the entire world. So NLT Study Bible says that the Hebrew Scriptures had predicted that the Gentiles would be converted, but they say what was not made clear was that they would become equal members of God's people. That somehow that Israel is going to basically include not just Jews, but all of these Gentiles. That's part of the plan. Now, I would imagine that according to the Tanakh, that's not an impossibility. That Israel is going to get gazillions of converts, but it's not what Paul's referring to here. Paul is not imagining that the Gentiles are going to reject Christianity and embrace Judaism. So according to the NLT Study Bible, what the mystery is, the secret is that at some point the Gentiles would be able to become part of Israel through embracing Jesus. And they won't have to become Jews. They're going to become equally part of God's people without becoming Jews. And that's the mystery according to the NLT Study Bible. Mm-hmm. But James Tabor, in his really important book, if anyone has not read it yet, I really highly recommend it. It's called Paul and Jesus. It's not light reading, but it's a really important look at the differences between Paul's teachings and the teachings of the Jesus movement prior to Paul. And what Professor Tabor says about this secret and this mystery, because the way he paints it, it really is sort of a mystery. He says that the secret and the mystery was that God had, since the beginning of time, a secret plan to bring to birth, to birth a new heavenly family. Like we know that, originally, let's say you go back to Genesis 1, so there was God and there were angels, and then, aside from the angelic realm, there became the earthly realm. And so there was a heavenly realm, and what Professor Tabor says is that God had a secret plan to actually bring forth a new heavenly family as his own offspring. The angels are not really considered to be the offspring of God. They're not considered to be his children in that kind of familial sense. And Professor Tabor says that these spirit beings, these new creations of God's family, will actually be more exalted than even the highest angels in the spiritual realm. And how does this happen? How will these new divine beings, they're going to happen by them becoming one with Jesus, just as Jesus, according to Paul, is not equal to God, but is certainly a divine being of some sort. Paul seems to be saying that when Christians attach themselves to Jesus, they become like Jesus in that they also become sons, so to speak, of God, and it becomes one super big family of sort of divine beings. I mentioned when we did this back in Romans 11, I believe, that it sounded like a very Mormon kind of thing, right? The Mormons speak about all these divine beings up in heaven, that when a Mormon dies and they go to the next world, they actually become promoted to becoming sort of a god.
I think you covered it also in a different area too, when we were discussing how when people of these other other cultures and stuff, they'll go hunting and they'll eat like the deer, the deer heart, and they'll become part of that animal, and they'll take on the characteristics of that thing. So
Exactly.
with the eating of the flesh and drinking of the blood, you take on that persona of Jesus. And it's a
Yes.
very pagan all through in and throughout.
Yeah, you sort of you ingest
Right.
the being that you want to actually become. There's sort of a very strong identification. And so what Professor Tabor claims is this is somehow this mystery. And he actually, if you study his book, he actually traces this through many of Paul's letters. It's not just here in Romans, but he shows that this is basically something that Paul's teaching all over the place. So it's not really clear what this mystery is. It's sort of mysterious. And don't forget that some of the New Testament writings say that Paul's writings themselves are very hard to understand. Right? So this is a very, obscure kind of phrase. What is this mystery? Now, what's to me really bizarre is that in the very next sentence, after speaking about this mystery that was kept secret since the world began, he says, but now it's made manifest and by the prophetic scriptures made known to all the nations. So I scratch my head and I wonder, what in the world does that mean? First of all, when Paul speaks about prophetic scriptures, he's only referring to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible. And so which prophetic scriptures is he referring to about this mystery? And more importantly, if they were already in the Hebrew scriptures, if these teachings about this mystery are already manifest in the prophetic scriptures, so why does Paul say they were a secret until now? Meaning that if these were around for already hundreds and hundreds of years, allegedly in these prophetic scriptures, so why is this considered to be something that Paul is only revealing now, only kept secret until now? So I find this whole passage extremely puzzling in terms of what Paul is really speaking about. And then in his very last sentence, in verse 27, he speaks about obedience to the faith to God alone. There should be glory through Jesus the Messiah. So again, he's distinguishing between God and the Messiah Jesus. And again, that the obedience to the faith goes to God alone, but it's through this intermediary. I believe that what Paul understands Jesus to be is not God, the creator, but that Jesus is some kind of a obviously elevated supernatural being, according to Paul, who is an intermediary, a sort of go-between between human beings and God. According to Professor Tabor, he becomes that sort of bridge that once human beings attach themselves to Jesus through faith in him, they will also become divine, so to speak, like Jesus. Right. But even if you don't take that approach, whatever is going on in this mystery, Paul is saying that it seems that Jesus is an intermediary somehow to lead people to God. But I don't believe that Paul understood Jesus to be God the creator or equal to God the creator. I think that, I think I've pointed out already dozens of times that Paul is consistently and repeatedly distinguishing between Jesus and God. And that's a wrap. That's all I have to share on Romans.
Right.
It was nice studying it with you. We'll, God willing, when we get together next week, we'll begin 1 Corinthians.
That's good.
It's a very interesting book, to say the least, or letter. Hope we'll have a good time doing it.
Certainly. Yeah, we basically spent, 4 months on Romans?
Has it been that long?
16 chapters, so probably more since we missed a few weeks too. So a little bit more than 4 months. So that's all right. We take it one chapter at a time. Make sure we're not going to leave any stone unturned, for certain. So that's good. How is our schedule looking as Pesach approaches? Are we going to have a missing weekend through the? Have you checked your calendar? Because honestly, I'm not really sure how the calendar falls day by day exactly. So,
Well, I'll just tell you now that I will not be. I think Pesach falls out. Oh, actually, it may be Shabbat and Sunday. I think actually it could be that the first night is a Friday night,
okay.
which would mean that it's Shabbat and Sunday.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll just confirm my schedule
Okay.
with you. But I know that during Pesach, I will probably taking a vacation from Corinthians.
Okay, that sounds fine. Probably a good idea. Keep your Pesach kosher as possible.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, man. Well, it's been fun. It's been fun. Look forward to seeing you next week, Rabbi. Thank you for all the viewers out there. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and click the notifications bell to the right. Otherwise, your subscription to the YouTube channel is pointless. Like getting a YMCA card and never showing up to exercise. Yeah. About as worthless as a pizza at a Weight Watchers convention. Okay. Y'all have a great night. And that's a wrap. Love you, Rabbi. Thank you so much for all your time and dedication. Shalom, shalom. Take care, everyone.
Shalom.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו